Okay, welcome everybody. This is a webinar on the theme of geopolitical forces of current conflicts and the global chess game. Welcome, and this is being sponsored by the International Union for Land Value Taxation. I'm going to read Peter Smith, the presenter's bio. Peter's also a pretty brand new vice president for the UK for our organization. So we're really happy to have him. And he's going to share a PowerPoint that goes with his presentation. So Peter has published scientific articles and co-authored Rent Unmasked, winner of the People's Book Prize, which set out the link between economic rent, which means the unearned income, and profiteering from our natural resources, and environmental destruction. He's showing those linkages. He carries that argument forward as co-host of Fred Harrison's popular YouTube channel and on his Substack, Peter Smith Rewilding, one of the fastest growing environmental channels. It's the case he's made throughout his career that the land question in the Georgia's context is fundamental to solving every major issue humanity faces today, be it global warming, environmental destruction, global poverty, or world peace. A rare commentator on the linkage between environmental activism and economic justice, Peter was the force behind Britain's first beaver release at Ham Fen in 2001. If you haven't heard of beaver releases, they found that this is an incredible way to repair environmentally damaged land and to bring in the water and all the plants. I mean, it's really an amazing thing what the beavers can do to restore ecosystems. So he was the first in Britain to do a beaver release. He's been fighting licensing battles and government skepticisms that come with it. And since then, he's built and run wildlife charities, releasing thousands of rare animals back into the wild and restoring habitats across Britain. He founded the Wildwood Trust and Future Landscapes, and he grew both into multi-million pound operations. Peter's expertise has taken him worldwide, delivering practical rewilding and habitat restoration projects for major consultancies and governments. From Oliver Wyman and BCG to DEFRA, the European Commission, and the Saudi Public Investment Fund, advising on carbon markets and large-scale ecological restoration. That same expertise has seen him called on by UK police and security services for sensitive investigations. And we'll leave you with a question mark on what that was all about. So he's a regular broadcaster on wildlife programs, a commentator across British news, and a visiting lecturer at several prestigious academic institutions. Welcome, Peter. Welcome so much. We're really happy to have you with a focus on this important topic of geopolitics and current conflicts.
Thank you, Alana. Let me share my presentation. Hopefully everybody can see that coming up. Give me a thumbs up.
Yes.
Yep, you got it. Great.
Everybody can see it.
Okay, I've entitled this The Grander Chessboard, obviously in reference to Brzezinski's The Grand Chessboard, on the geopolitics of why people make the decisions they do and why we have so much conflict in the world. So before I start, I thought it would be good to define economic rent, which I know many people, especially if they aren't in Georgia circles, won't understand. So economic rent is the wealth generated not by productive labor or capital investment, but by monopolizing land, natural resources, and strategic geography. But rent is much more complex than that. It runs through money itself, who controls currency creation, who controls monetary flows, the legal codes that enforce ownership, intellectual property, and title. My thesis, of course, is that nations and empires do not go to war over free markets or democracy. They go to war to secure exclusive rights to extract rents. Nations rarely fight wars on their own. The people who run them do. They manipulate the populace to personally enrich themselves from whatever the rent gets captured. Once rent is privatized, war, coups, proxy conflicts stop being costs to a collective, a country, but they become investments by those elites. And that return does not flow to the nation, it flows to individual families, firms, who holds the rights after that conflict. We can see throughout history, the recent history, Ricardo, Henry George, and a lot of this essay is really inspired by Professor Mason Gaffney, in his essay and lectures on rent seeking, what he calls the grosser sense, the seizure of rent-bearing assets by force and government capture. I think this is best explained, which was in the recent Hollywood movie with Hermann Goering, when he was quoted by his captor and psychologist in the statement, why, of course, the people don't want war. Why would some poor slob on a farm want to risk his life in a war when the best he can get out of it is to come back to his farm in one piece? Naturally, the common people don't want war, neither in Russia, nor England, nor America, nor for that matter in Germany. That is understood. But after all, it is the leaders of the country who determine the policy, and it is always a simple matter to drag people along, whether it's a democracy, a fascist dictatorship, parliament, or communist dictatorship. And when challenged on the concept that democracies don't go to war, Goering replied, oh, that's all well and good, but voice or no voice, the people can always be brought to the bidding of the leaders. It's easy. All you have to do is tell them that they're being attacked and denounced, and the pacifists for lack of patriotism and exposing the country to danger. It works the same way in any country. And we've certainly seen that prophetic quote come real in the history since the Second World War. So we're developing a concept of geopolitical landlords. These landlords, they grow rich without work, while in their sleep, without working, risking, or economizing, as John Stuart Mill would tell us. The spirit of protectionism and monopoly is one of enmity and strife, contrasted with the fraternity and peace offered by free trade, as expressed in his book on free trade by Henry George. And Smedley Butler, the famous war hero, in his pamphlet, War's a Racket, it's always been, it is possibly the oldest, easily the most profitable, surely the most vicious. It is the one, it's one of international scope. It is the only one which the profits are reckoned in dollars and the losses in lives. So taking on board the history of the International Union and its Georgist origins, I would say peace is perfectly aligned in the mission. And to understand why we go to war and how sharing rents prevents that is fundamental to our objectives. The grander chessboard, we have to understand that geopolitics has changed over the years. It's gone beyond territorial control. You know, it's not great Eurasian geopolitical struggles about conquering populations. It's about choke points, it's energy pipelines, it's the rents generated by trade routes. So the neo-colonial game of modern empire is through the control of siphoning resources, controlling those economic flows and resource flows, and keeping them trapped as tributary economies to the central power of mostly the United States overtaking Europe. So we've got 5 flashpoints around the world: the Middle East and West Asia, Ukraine and Russia, Africa, the New World, and the West itself is becoming its own flashpoint. And we will explore, 6th, we will explore the remedy. So the first thing we need to do when we analyze why we go to war, why we have conflicts, what is the things that correlate? So, as you know, I'm an ecologist, and my background is in statistical analysis. And that's why we have to look at statistical analysis. Now, there's a huge academic literature on geopolitics, war, international relations, is how most people frame it. But really, we need to look at the base statistics of why we have wars. And the Correlates of War project is one of the ways of doing that. There's a few institutions that have modeled what are the fundamental reasons that correlate. Doesn't mean it's causality, but they correlate with conflict. The first one is information asymmetry, in that often people go to war when they think they have some kind of advantage that the other party doesn't have. The second one is greed and grievances. So this shows that where you've got stagnant or low income for the people who are poorly educated, they've got high dependency on specific economic issues, that greed and grievance becomes a central factor in why nations go to war. Rent-seeking behavior has been correlated, and this is obviously central to what we, the International Union, are interested in. That the more rent-seeking behavior you have in a country, the more likely it's to go to war. Liquid capital, and that if the elites are not going to lose by going to war, but they can move their capital and retain their wealth, that country is far less likely to go to war. The control of the military-industrial complex is another correlating factor. And you've got all the different types of third-party effects. Is the majority of wars today are really caused by external actors forcing countries to going to war, putting their own place people in, using them as proxies, subverting governments to get that political structure that will choose to go to war in the grand chess game of the controlling powers. But the biggest quantitative drivers in conflict are transnational ethnic networks. That's where powerful ethnic kin in a neighboring country is probably the biggest factor to people choosing war. And that certainly can be seen within the major conflicts we see today. In Russia and Ukraine, there is a deep embedded ethnic grouping between those two countries. Much of Russia is really, a lot of the public support in Russia is about protecting Russian speakers and ethnically Russian people within Ukraine. And without that, I don't think Putin could have pushed Russia to war. And then those strategic external rents where elites are decoupled from the populace in their economic resources and power, where foreign military aid is given, where budgets are supported externally and favorable trade terms, they decouple a regime from its own population in heeding their natural reluctance to go to war. Certainly, we can see that precisely with what's going on in the world today, especially in Ukraine. The Ukraine project between Russia and Ukraine, the conflict has been externally funded for many decades, and increasingly so in the last 14 years. So the other, I'm going to quickly skip over that slide. Do excuse me. Right. So I said this was really, my talk here is just aping and updating what Mason Gaffney said in 1988. And I base a lot of this on the essay I wrote, aping what Mason said. That national defense, as pertaining to America, is a public good, is a lie. The costs of policing rent-bearing assets are socialized. So America's war machine has been about protecting national and policing rent-bearing assets for America. And the American public have had to pay for that. But the benefits are all privatized. They accrue to energy shareholders, defense contractors, and the oligarchs, both within America and within the countries being subverted. And as Mason said, the lords and barons have much at stake, the serfs and vagrants very little. Great essay. I would recommend anybody to look that up and read it. So the flashpoint one is the Middle East. We've got oil and gas. We've got a lot of history. The original sin in the conflict with Iran, Iran has suffered colonial control for over 200 years, mostly from my country, the Brits. We have, and also the Russians had control of Iran for quite some time. But essentially, all the leaders of Iran for the last 200 years have essentially been controlled, and they developed monopolies over its resources that were extracted for the leaders, the small oligarch of the Shahs, and for the benefits of the Russian Empire or the British Empire. This went right up until 1951, when Mohammad Mossadegh was installed as prime minister, and for the first time they had a nationalist leader who wanted to return the rents of its oil back to its citizens. And so we can see
removed.
He certainly was. And he was removed by Operation Boot and Operation Ajax, which we, at the time, of course, was all denied, but it's now come out. MI6 and a new CIA overthrew him in 1953. They did that by paying people in the military, the generals, and thousands of criminals to riot on the streets, so they could create a compliant new Shah. And that Shah's regime was the most brutal, evil regime you could imagine. The SAVAK, the brutal secret police that enforced Western oil tenure through systematic torture of its citizens. And this is the policing of the land, as Gaffney put out in his essay, is that we appoint evil dictators who rule by torture and fear as long as the oil rents flow back to our powers. The 1979 revolution was obviously a reaction to that. But as we know, all revolutions create their own problems, because a revolutionary has to be sexually as evil as the people they overthrow. And today's sanction war and hot war is all about those rents of that oil. And it's got nothing to do with democracy or any of the other things they put on TV. This has purely been a war. It's been a war for 200 years over a country that has not, until recently, been strong enough to defend itself. We can see now that it's China behind Iran. 80 to 90% of its oil exports are bought by China via shadow networks, circumventing the controls of America. A fifth of the world's oil passes through the Straits of Hormuz, and we've all come to understand that over the last few months of the war. And it has the fourth largest proven oil reserves and the second largest gas reserves. They've got quite a lot of other stuff, but basically it's all about oil and gas. And what we're seeing now in our multipolar world is that Iran is finally strong enough to stand up to America. But why did America choose to start this war? Now, Eldridge Colby, occasionally, President Trump, because of his own narcissism, but also many people in the state apparatus, will tell you the truth. That the Pentagon's China strategist, Eldridge Colby, put it a shot to get a better situation in Ukraine and gain leverage over China, both by stopping the flow of oil to China and to create a more isolated Russia. And that has been admitted is why the Trump administration has chosen to start this war. We think it's Israel, and it is Israel. They're very much involved in this. But the deep thinkers of geopolitics, it's just a grand game of global domination, like playing Risk at the weekend. We've also got to think of Gaza and what's going on in Gaza in the West Bank. I've written about this in 2 essays. The biggest problem you've got in Israel is the cost of living in Israel is extreme because land values from investment have pushed up and it's suppressed the population's ability to actually survive. And the only way to be able to have a new life is to go and steal the land from Gaza and the West Bank. And that, I think, has been deliberately put in place. You've also got the other factor that there's vast gas reserves off the coast of Israel and Gaza, and they can only be developed if peace is achieved. And peace, it's a Roman peace for the poor Gazans in that utter defeat and removal. In Lebanon, we can see other Georgist factors coming in here. The Litani River is an incredible... If you control the Litani River, you control the Lebanon. And that is what has been done brutally by the Israeli government. It's the oldest Georgia story. If you control the territory, if you can get a choke point, you control the masses. We'll move on to Ukraine and Russia. So we're going to talk about the Black Earth, the Donbass minerals, and the road that eventually leads to Beijing. The harvest of blood and soil, the Chernozem and the Donbass. So the Chernozem is the hugely deep, 12-foot, 14-foot deep black soil, the gold of the Ukraine and Russia, in that it is the most naturally productive farmland on Earth by far. And it is also an area of fantastic mineral wealth. This is precisely in the area that has Russian, ethnic Russian people living there. And it has been a bone of contention. So you can see that the invasion by Russia in geopolitical terms, yes, it's partly to do with ethnicity and the brutal treatment of the people of the Donbass by the Western Ukrainians. But also it is about the future revenues. And if we look at why Moscow did this, it talks about security with NATO, but they are fearful of destabilizing Russia. And I think that's more of a factor than actually just the mineral wealth. Ooh. But the ultimate prize in the geopolitical control of the area is not Russia itself, even though Russia has got the biggest natural resources that are untapped in the world. And yes, they want to go back. The Western powers want to get access to that cheaper than on the fair free trade exchange, which is available now. They want to destabilize and break up Russia. and be able to control governments and access it. But the biggest factor in this is they really want to isolate China. They want compliant governments within the Russian Federation not to support China. It is the only way America can gain the top spot again and control the rise of China. So Africa. The geopolitics of African resources are well known to many. I was amazed by Michael Kuka Mumbalang. I can't pronounce the word. I won't even try to. He did this amazing presentation over the World Cup where he stood silent for the 90 minutes to be a living Lumumba and recognized what happened to Patrice Lumumba back in 1960. Again, we had a newly democratic country where Lumumba became prime minister and he announced that its wealth, mostly the copper mines, but other huge wealth that lives there, was going to be used for the benefit of the country, not all. And immediately the CIA began plotting his assassination. There's a fascinating story with one of the top CI people who found out that he liked Western toothpaste and had a poisoned toothpaste tube sent to be placed in his bathroom. That never happened. Their attempts to assassinate him didn't work. It was actually the Belgian forces that, and mostly of their private mining companies, the former colonial power, who eventually persuaded the Katanga militias to seize power, and they captured poor old Patrice, and he was tortured to death and shot. And even his body was dissolved in acid. A horrendous thing. But this is one example of many that happens to Africa. Where African countries have had some form of natural resource capture, and I've been fortunate to live in those countries where they've had it for a while. Botswana, famously with their De Beers, captured some of the diamond rents, and that is one of the best countries when you look at all the statistics of infant mortality and all the other things. It's not done quite as well lately. Namibia, place I've worked in a few times, a similar joint venture, some forms of economic liberalism. It's a complex picture, but again, Namibia is, you can walk around, it's safe, there's hospitals, schools, it's fantastic, and it's done. And pre-2011, Libya was essentially the best place to live in Africa. Yes, it had a dictatorial leader, but you could go to university, you could have a house, you could, start a business, you could have your healthcare and your education was all free. Once we found a way to destabilize and take control of Libya, it's descended into a hellhole where there's open slave auctions in Tripoli and the quality of life is beyond appalling. So rent left uncaptured or captured then lost is essentially your defining mechanism between having a country with good living standards, low crime, lack of conflict. And if you lose that rent or you never get that rent as government income, that's where you've got crime, conflict, war, and the host of those powers around that are trying to do that. We do have a modern living Lumumba in the guise of Captain Ibrahim Traore, who seized power in 2022, and he started spending money on schools, hospitals. Again, China's hands behind this, but in 4 short years, he really has made a difference. What if all countries in Africa could claim their rents as their own government revenue? There would be amazing places. They would turn around their countries. And it's that conflict that's gone on for so long. So I do hope that the spirit of Lumumba lives on in those trying to make a difference. Flashpoint 4, we've got Venezuela and Greenland. We can see that the geopolitical minds in America wanted Venezuelan oil before they moved into the war with Iran. They needed to control that oil, and they made all the plays to get that. And again, Greenland is just a strategic move to get those natural resources before America opens its major conflict with China in the coming decade or decades. It's just little moves on a chessboard. And Trump hasn't even begun to hide his feelings. It's all to be controlled by him. Does that mean him personally? Does that mean his family members? Because they all seem to be making a lot of money from it. So it's all about that hegemonic case of stealing wealth from others, the natural resources, and not giving it for the benefit of the country, but just the elites. Greenland has got some serious, interesting minerals, but its ecology will be a catastrophe if those are mined. And we can see strange moves even going on today. There's reports in the news this week that some companies have started trying to drill for oil and do other investigations in Greenland, which just looks like a prelude to either an invasion or forcing Denmark to relinquish it. So the final point of conflict is the West itself. We've created our own doom loop in our own economies and political instability. We've chosen extraction over production. Now, my thesis is, along with many others, is that while the Soviet Union existed, Western elites had to operate under a discipline because you could not allow a rentier economy to hollow out wages, services, all that kind of things that we enjoyed since the Second World War, because that would have made us look worse than the Soviet Union. It was the discipline put on our elites and our rent seekers. That's why we had welfare state, union wages, public infrastructure, public schools. That was the price that the elites had to pay. When that constraint of the Soviet Union disappeared, so did that discipline. And as Michael Hudson famously said, taproots feeding financial power, real estate, natural resource rents, monopoly rents, instead of investing in plant and equipment to hire more labor, to produce more output, the money is just financialized. And that's exactly what's happened since the 1980s. We've become an increasingly financial economic world, and the very things that support our culture and economies, the infrastructure, is all breaking down, certainly breaking down in the UK. And Mariana Mazzucato famously said, value extracting activities came to masquerade as value creating activities. And in this process, rents got confused with profits. Once that distinction is lost, you cannot reward production over extraction. You end up just rewarding extraction. And our whole economies cannot do anything but just increase more and more extraction while the fundamental things in our economies are reducing. So let's use what I set out before. What are the things that predict conflict? The new multipolarity, the single Pax Americana, is being eroded. It's fracturing. Rival power blocks are rising. And we're entering a Thucydides trap scenario where one power transfers to another power. That is where conflict arises. We have wages are stagnating, if not dropping, for the poor, and a rising cost of living. Elite wealth is being delinked from the main economy. You can see this in a grotesque form with the concept of artificial intelligence, the Elon Musks of this world, thinking that their wealth is completely delinked from the actual economy. All our politicians are essentially captured. There is no real political choice in the West. Everything is maintained that we used to have a political choice between a moderate left and a moderate right, and now we're getting a more extreme right-wing populist politicians, but that's no choice either. These people will just enrich their own oligarchs. We've also got ethnic tensions, number 5. That is without shared prosperity, we turn on neighbors, especially from ethnic minorities, and that's increasingly happening within the UK and America and Europe. And the other thing is there are a number of forces that want to destabilize the fabric of our economies and cultures and amplify and exploit internal fractures. And that can come from Russia, it can come from China, but it also can come, I postulate, from the increasing transnational elites who want to see countries weakened and strengthen those transnational systems. So, sharing the rents, the solution, the remedy. How do we fix the world's problems, and why does sharing rents, taxing land, why does it solve the problem? When we tax rent, not work, you can't pass it on. So it's not going to be passed on to poor people. It removes all speculation and it rewards production. It makes an honest economy. These are the standard arguments that have come around this since the physiocrats through to Henry George, David Ricardo, Adam Smith. It's all well laid out and nobody has ever challenged it. It is exactly what it is. But why does it end war? And what does it do? It removes, when you tax all the rents of all different types, it removes the money that would be given to the people who earn money when we go to war. Those specific companies and those elites, both in country and external actors, cannot make any money through the conflict, through the geopolitical tension. There is no possible way. So you remove the point of the war. If Trump's family friends can't enrich themselves playing on the stock market, if they can't enrich themselves through essentially taking private ownership of Venezuela's oil because it's already been taxed, well, there's no reason for them to do it. So the closing argument is strangle the unearned rent and you strangle the money that fuels the madness. You don't need to persuade the next petrostate, the next trading house, the next political donor, the next CIA deep state strategist or tech bro. You simply take away the thing that they're fighting over, which is the rent. Thank you.
Bravo, Peter. Thank you. Terrific. And rent also means unearned income, right?
Yes.
It's stuff that people are getting that they didn't make the profit from the land and resources. So tax the unearned income and leave people with their earned income. That's our message. You painted a big, broad, and deep picture here for us. And I'm going to be looking for any kind of hands up for questions or comments or input from those who've been listening to your presentation. Want to hear from you, anything you want Peter to develop in a little more depth for you, any questions or any input. I see Liz's hand. Please go ahead, Liz.
Yeah, I'm still not good with figuring out which button gets me the
You're
hand.
on, you're good.
I thank you, Peter, so much for clarifying so many of the necessary points, specifically the one about exactly what it is that these people get that can be taken away from them. But I like to make the point, when you're dealing with a heroin addict who has really sneaky ways to get the heroin, and I actually think that we have been living through that phase. They are literally addicted. I love the quote that one of our, at one of our roundtables, we had I forget, Alana, anyway, he brought in a quote, Georges, he brought in a quote from some kind of very wealthy industrialist commenting about the fact he wasn't at all afraid of Lenin. He was afraid of Henry George. And I thought that, I said, I got it, because I always grew up understanding, so the leftist side of things and the working class mentality. But I did notice there was a conflict in people thinking that the thing called socialism meant that you had no private ownership. They really succeeded in aligning, communism, socialism, anything like that with private ownership is kind of over and undermined. Anyway, so my question to you actually involves something I'm familiar with called the American system. And I've heard a lot of people touting that almost in competition with the Georgia solutions. And I actually wondered if, you had any, because I know they have they don't seem to talk at all about land value or anything like that. It's all about infrastructure and big investment. And Alexander Hamilton and the whole history going back in this country. So I am curious about how, as a Georgia solution, with Georgia Solutions, how you would address somebody bringing you that kind of solution.
To understand your question, is American business is about investment and a return on that investment. Yeah, how to guarantee a return. Yeah, completely. Mm-hmm. And the whole America, that's the American system, want to go around, not really within America, but around the world, and to force people, both by legal means, by international treaties, international courts, if that's what you mean by the American system, where they literally can force countries to play by the rules, where American capital will get a monopoly return.
Well, this is the Alexander Hamilton economics. Right. That's what I'm referring to. These are people who are going back to the origin of the banking system and Hamilton's role in creating basically an American economy as opposed to one controlled by the British Empire.
Well, this is a focus on the monetary control issue as well, and the establishment of more infrastructure in order to support enterprise.
Right.
As Liz says, those advocates do not have any understanding of the land problem or the tax shifts. So I think in a kind of a broad scope, we're asking, what do we do about these other movements that are so certain that they have the whole picture, but are missing the land, the entire land question?
Yeah, we had our American system advocate, Nancy, I actually forget her last name now.
Price.
Well, yeah, and she, I still get her newsletter because we invited her. She was, representing the American system. And so I see, what these people talk about, and they show no interest at all in, I think they would, in combining with the Georgia solutions, if their idea is large infrastructure, like it would be like federal investment of infrastructure versus state and local, where the Georgias is more focused on the local. and they're focused on the big infrastructure projects, that kind of thing.
Federal investment means using the taxpayers' money, but they're never asking what is the proper source for the taxpayer, who should be paying those taxes. That's the issue that they're not facing.
They never address that at all. So
yeah.
anyway.
So Peter.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not aware of that movement. There are many movements that claim they have the solution. In the UK, we have MMTers. There's a big movement at the moment for wealth taxes, a very big movement that's gained some traction. The Green Party are supporting it. I mean, you can only counter with the reality that if you tax things, the deadweight costs of those taxes exceed the benefits of the investment under our current system. And a lot of people, when they do start talking about it, there was a recent discussion on a Channel 4 documentary, had land tax as a very narrow tax, and people arguing that it wouldn't raise enough money, the usual things. So there is no solution to that problem apart from communicate and get the message out as best you can and have as many good examples. I'm a good friend of Fred Harrison, who's one of the brightest thinkers on this matter, and I talk to him, for the last 20 years on these matters. He has tried to make those arguments. He feels it's more about a social movement, about what's created. He calls it cheating in his latest book. How can you make the idea of unearned income as disgusting as committing a crime or, beating up some old lady? That having it as a moral framework that you should only ever earn what you earn, and anybody who earns money that is unearned is a social pariah and should be ostracized and made an example of being evil. You are hurting the common good.
Yes.
So that's what Fred's trying to do at the moment.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent focus. I do. When I understood that, that's when I signed on to the Georgia solution with Alana, because that made common sense to me. That is the problem. But then extending it to land value obviously, reaches a far higher level than, let's say, Wall Street as my focus on unearned income, which it was before that.
The trouble is communication and how people in societies work. I mean, if you go back 15 years, I was an incredibly popular. I was never off the TV in the UK. I was being interviewed. I used to regularly go to Oxford and Cambridge and lecture. The minute I started tacking on the end of my lectures land value tax and why it was the only way to save nature, all those invitations started drying up.
It goes back. We had a Native American lecturer, academic, and also a Native American spiritual elder named John Mohawk, passed away just maybe 10 years ago. And John said the problem of the Western world began 500 years ago. He was not talking about Christopher Columbus. He was talking about the enclosures of Britain. He was talking about how the people were pushed off the common land after the Magna Carta, correct? These enclosures movements of hundreds of years, and pushed into the cities, into extremely impoverished working conditions. There's a poem from that enclosures period by people who were trying to reclaim the commons. And Peter would have heard of this poem. It's the law hangs the man or woman who steals a goose from off the commons, but lets the greater rascal loose that steals the commons from the goose. So land enclosure, land privatization, land markets for private profit, originating in these enclosures hundreds of years ago, carried forward into the United States without any recognition of the land problem and the money problem that impoverished the people in Europe and England, leading them to flee to the United States. There is no human right in the Declaration of Independence, the American Constitution, the Bill of Rights. There is absolutely nothing that gives the common people the rights to the land and resources as a birthright, nor does these major United Nations declarations of human rights, declarations of economic human rights, so carefully composed by all UN member states as human rights declarations. The land problem, the land rights issue, has been the third rail. As Peter just said, his invitations dropped when he started talking about it. Talk about the land problem and the land value tax solution. Hey, you're a pariah. But this is exactly what the third rail is that we need to touch and show, hey, the third rail has a lot of energy. It has energy to remove these many systems of exploitation, poverty, and war. Look at it, people. Take a deep breath and look at it and speak about it, which is what we're doing today. Because the elites controlling the narrative, the message, the media don't want us to look here, which is exactly why this is where we need to work. So what do you think about that old Enclosures poem, Peter?
Oh, the Enclosures poem is deep to my heart. I mean, yeah. I come from the northeast of England. I'm what's known as a Geordie or Pitmatic. And Thomas Spence is my hero. You'll have heard of Thomas Paine. Not many will have heard of Thomas Spence. And he was jailed for writing pamphlets basically saying every area, administrative area, parish should collect taxes on the land rent as community revenue and share that out amongst everybody and use it for building public infrastructure. And it's been a tradition that only a few have held throughout history. And even, before the physiocrats, people had that ideas. It's a torch we must hold because without it, humanity is literally doomed. What is our future without collecting rents? It's war, it's famine, it's economic, it's a dystopia of conflicts and environmental destruction. It is the only solution. And all these other solutions, people talk about MMT and various other forms of politics are diversions. Socialism sounds great. And I used to call myself a socialist for many years. But what's the problem is it doesn't always work. You have to have a fundamental solution. So Georgism to me is just smart socialism. It's the best for everybody, and it's the only way we're going to tackle the challenges.
What year was Thomas Spence? What year was he?
He was back in the mid 1700s. He was a contemporary of Thomas Paine, slightly before. I bet you Thomas Paine probably read some Spence's work.
Probably, and Paine was familiar with the physiocrats as well. Yes. So we talk about Henry George as the more recent, very strong and clear voice, but this is really a perennial wisdom teaching around the fundamentally true, just, correct relationship of people to the planet itself. And since all produced material wealth comes from labor on land, it is a primary issue. And when not understood or when institutions of politics are not based on this perennial wisdom teaching, we see wealth accumulation in the hands of the few, corruption and eventual war and collapse. And this is just sick. What you see, the land problem, you just see it's a cyclical problem. And the truth gets rediscovered because it's just a fundamental intuitive wisdom teaching. You ask people, who should own the earth? Should it be held as a birthright for all people? Nobody says no to that. They say yes intuitively. Yes, we should fairly share our planet as a birthright. But the but comes up very quickly. The but is, that's impractical. That's a dream. That's visionary. And then we can talk about the actual practical policies based on this ethic. How do we bring up the land problem to people's consciousness? What is the best way to do it? I mean, making the connection between war and the land problem, I think is very important because we do have some significant peace movements in Britain and the United States that are not yet seeing the land problem. I think this is one area that is fertile grounds for our insights. And Peter working with the environmental movement. Now that is really a unique perspective, to have people who advocate for environmental and ecological protection and restoration to see that there's an economic justice angle.
Yeah.
That's what Peter is, a rare voice in seeing that. Could you talk a minute about that connection that allows you to see the importance of something like land ownership and taxation to the ecological work you were doing?
Of course. So I was obsessed with nature as a kid. I went and studied biological sciences. Actually, my first degree was medical biochemistry with a genetics subsidiary. But I was always into nature. My grandfather taught about it, so I went into a professional career. I did higher degrees and then got a professional job in nature conservation organizations. And it was there looking at what nature reserves worked and what didn't that I realized it was all the old commons in England that were the areas of high biodiversity. Without fail, all the private land and even public land that was called a nature reserve, even charity-owned land owned by nature conservation charities, wasn't as good for nature as the commons. And that's because commons had restricted access. So many charities were doing stupid things. They were sending volunteers with chainsaws and saws to try and manage the land, when it was the old commons that had an old grazer who'd send a couple of cows on there or whatever, but restricted grazing, that created these really high biodiversity spaces where all the rare creatures lived. And that both interested me as an early advocate of rewilding, using nature to manage itself. But also, why did that happen? It was because it was commons. So I started getting interested in land economics and finally fell into the Georges camp as I explored. The other thing that I explored was I was doing a lot of fundraising. I was probably the most successful fundraiser in what's known as the Wildlife Trust movement by far. I was very good at persuading people to give us money and setting up donation systems, because I was a computer nerd. But all that money was just pushing up the price of the land. We weren't buying any more land. The value was just going up. And then the government started giving huge amounts of money to buy land. Again, there was no more land being bought. The price, the value, the price we had to pay for the land just went up and up. In fact, I published an article about this in British Wildlife Journal, a very prestigious journal, just a few months ago, where I calculated the value of submarginal land in Britain since the 1970s has gone up 150 times. Far, far, far higher than residential land because of the nature conservation. So the whole nature conservation movement has been stifled because of the land economic factor. You cannot save nature no matter how much money you raise, because the landlords will extract it from you. And now we're just renting land from landowners to have a tiny bit of wildlife on the edge of their fields, and we're paying a fortune for it. And that's why I became a Georgist, because you had to understand how economics work. And if you want to save nature, there is no possible way to do it without Georgism. None. We've proved time and time again we're losing wildlife. All the statistics of people like me who go out and examine these things, it's showing that nature's getting less and less and less in Britain, and it's happening across the world. And it's precisely because those that can use land will extract the value from it. People who've got control of land want to make money, and they make money by destroying nature. And Ricardo tells us if we have a land value tax, we're going to move that margin of production. More land's just going to be left to the wild, and then nature doesn't need humans. That's what rewilding's about. Nature doesn't need us. It doesn't need us to pretend. All the wildlife charities love saying, oh, you need us to have volunteers and professional reserve managers, and we're going to go and save nature. No, just tell them to go away. Just leave the bloody thing alone. Yes, you need to have complex interaction between large herbivores, and you need to control their numbers to have the right balance. But once you get some natural grazing herbivores, you've got nutrient cycling, you have massively complicated relationships between how plants grow and animals. It's such beautifully complex once you start learning what is ecology. And that's me. I am an ecologist. I've spent my life studying it. But now, whenever I talk to anybody, I stop talking about ecology, which everybody wanted to hear me wax lyrically about all these relationships. Now I just talk about land value tax because it's the only way you're going to protect nature.
Yeah. That's great, Peter. From Mother Earth's wisdom to the importance of land value taxation has been your road. That's beautiful. Maybe you would like to tell us a little bit about your current project, land project, that I know you're excited about and putting a lot of inspired energy into as a way to end this wonderful presentation with you. Would you like to?
Yes, so I've got two projects I'm running at the moment. One is something I've been banging on about for 25 years. I remember as a young man, I wrote to a government consultation that we needed natural flood management. The reason the places are being flooded is because we've destroyed the river catchments that can't hold water back, and it all floods over barren fields with no carbon in the soil into river basins and floods towns, right? So we need to get natural flood management. That's one of the reasons I reintroduced beavers. So I was the first person to reintroduce beavers to the UK, which I'm enormously proud. I cannot tell you, one day I'll finish writing my book on it, the unfathomable efforts I had to go to in skullduggery and fundraising and manipulating politicians and co-opting government agencies to get past the people who tried to stop it. But anyway, so we've got this idea that nature can protect us from water pollution, from air pollution, from soil erosion. So we call those ecosystem services. That's what people in the business call them now. So I've got a project doing precisely that. Around an area I manage, I have created all these beaver-like structures and improved the habitat that when the heavy rain falls, it is absorbed. It's either put behind beaver-like dams, it absorbs into the soil, and I've got a big scientific project that has proven that this works. It will protect the village from flooding. So that's been extended, that project. So this year I received quite a lot of money, £500,000 in government to prove that this system works scientifically. And next year I'm starting this sort of development of this on a much bigger area where we're not just looking at farmland, we're also looking at peri-urban areas. So I've got a £3 million project starting next year, which I'm setting up at the moment. So that's one side of what I'm doing. As I was doing this project, a farm came on the market in one of the areas we're working with. And so I set up a new charity called Future Landscapes Trust to deliver these new types of landscapes that will be climate resilient and will protect us in the future. And the other project I'm running is what we're calling the Marsham Vale project, where we're buying this farm. We've got an agreement from the seller. I've got some funding in place to purchase it. Hopefully the purchase will go through in 2 or 3 months. And then I want to recreate a commons. It's a humble idea that we're going to have me and my two compatriots who I've roped into this are going to become the stewards. We have no ownership, no right of income, but we are going to be the protectors of the land, like the Lord of the Manors used to be. And then people can buy in as commoners, and we're going to share the land. A lot of it will be rewilded, but some of it will be used as nature-based farming and enjoyment. And that's near the town of Hastings, which is high deprivation. So we're going to try to create a place where people can get connected to the land, grow food, and feel like a commoner, and we will run it as a true commons.
Bravo. Wow. Wonderful. Wonderful. Direct action, direct land access action. Beautiful, Peter. This has been terrific. I'm not seeing any other hands up. So I'm assuming we're good to go and to let Peter go and for us to continue on with our day. Thank you all for participating. Thank you for your presence. Thank you so much, Peter. This was fantastic. Really appreciate it. All the best to you.
I did want to make a quick suggestion to you. I think that you should make sure you get some kind of documentarian following you every day. And you should have an immediate world, premiere of what you're doing. I think that, it's
Peter
critical.
Gibb, Rewilding and Reclaiming the Commons.
I mean,
the media, yeah.
I have had whole TV programs in the past in the UK. It's not like I'm not unknown. So there's plenty of stuff on YouTube. You can just put my name in and you can see me running around Europe, collecting beavers and managing wild horses and doing all kinds of things. But you're absolutely right. We need to demonstrate this.
Yeah,
and luckily, my two compatriots are younger than me. One is a sort of groovy chef who has won second prize in MasterChef competition a few years ago. So he's actually on the TV as well. So together, hopefully, we will popularize all of this.
Yeah. And you can slip in the unearned income issue, constantly building a backstory about land value and, all of that stuff. Use this as the cover.
Okay. So we'll be on a roll here. Looking forward. Again, thank you, everybody. Bye. Take care.